Hello everyone, my name is Aisha Chiandet and I'm the water scientist with the Severn Sound Environmental Association, and I'm here to talk to you about algae growth in the Severn Sound area. So the goal for this talk is really to give you some tools and tips so when you see algae out in your shoreline area, to be able to distinguish whether it's merely a nuisance or potentially a harmful growth. And we're going to talk a little bit about some preventative measures that we can take to help to reduce some of those nuisance algae growths. Before we start, a little bit of background on who the Severn Sound Environmental Association is. We're a watershed-based organization. It was established back in 1997 that came out of the remedial action plan process for Severn Sound, which used to be listed as an area of concern on the Great Lakes. So Severn Sound was delisted in 2003, but the SSEA continued on, and we now exist as a joint municipal service board, which was established in 2009. So we exist as a partnership between the 8 municipalities in the watershed. We are also a source protection authority under the Ontario Clean Water Act and assist with municipal drinking water source protection activities. So to dive in, what is algae? Algae are microscopic single-celled plants which can exist as either single cells or groups of cells in colonies, and those colonies are what tend to be more visible. They can live either suspended in the water or attached to things like rocks or other plants, or parts of your dock, or they can also grow as what we call macroalgae, which actually look plant-like and actually can be rooted right into the lake sediment like a plant. Algae are a very old and very diverse form of life. You can see the images down on the screen there. Lots of different forms that are quite interesting. And they form a very vital component of the aquatic food web. So it's really sort of the base of that food web that supports zooplankton feeding and also small fish, and work its way to form the energy base of that food web. So the issue with algae really comes from having too much growth in one particular area or dominance by one particular species or group. So we can see blooms occasionally that will be either mixed in the water and sort of have that pea soup look. They can form mats on either the lake bottom or the surface, sort of look like surface scums. We can see slimes that develop or biofilms that will develop on submerged surfaces. And excessive algae growth can lead to oxygen depletion. So when the algae dies and decomposes, that process uses up oxygen, which can be a problem in deeper waters, especially for cold water fish that can't stay in those waters due to low oxygen. There's concern from shoreline users also, so attached algae on rocks, for example, can make surfaces very slippery. Low water clarity and just sort of a nasty green color is not very nice looking to swim in. And then we can also have specific nuisance or harmful algae that can cause particular problems. So for example, with aesthetics, so there might be a disagreeable smell or look to the water as algae might be breaking down. Certain types of the macroalgae can actually start to clog up boat anchors. Different types of algae can also clog drinking water filters. And some species can produce compounds that will show up in drinking water as well. So even though the water's been treated and is safe to drink, you can still have these taste and odor compounds. So they can give the water either sort of a fishy taste or a cucumbery taste. Geranium sort of depends on the species of algae. And then finally, we can see algal toxins. So from very particular species, they can produce toxins that can affect the skin, the respiratory system, the nervous system, the liver, and so on. So as far as classifying types of algae, taxonomically, we sort of break them down based on their pigments and their cell structure. But from a practical standpoint, it's sort of more useful to break them down based on what they look like out in the environment. So for this talk, we're going to go through different types of algae that you might see out around your shoreline. So starting with free-floating algae, so these would include your blue-green algae blooms and other types of algae that can bloom lower down in the water and be mixed in the water column. We'll talk about mat-forming algae that will form surface mats, attached algae that you might see on rocks in filamentous forms and also biofilms, and then macroalgae, which look like plants, as I mentioned. Some algae can actually occur in multiple forms, so in small concentrations, they might exist as free-floating cells, and as the density builds up, they can start to form mats where you can actually see them. So starting with the free-floating algae, surface blooms, so these are your blue-green algae blooms. They can take different forms depending on the species. In some cases, there are some species that will clump together and look like green peas in the water. Most of the time, they will look like, colonies will look like spilled paint, either right on the surface or maybe just below the surface. Other species can clump together and look like fingernail clippings, just floating on the surface of the water. And some of these species can produce toxins or taste and odor compounds. It's very difficult to tell just based on looking at a bloom whether toxins would be present. They're not always. Sometimes you can see a really dense looking bloom and there's actually no or very little toxin concentration. But it's best to assume that toxins are present until testing shows otherwise. So you need to avoid contact with that water and use of the water and report it to the Spills Action Center, the phone number given below there. And we'll go through those steps to take later in the presentation as well. So other types of free-floating algae that you might see where the bloom is maybe more mixed in the water. So it's difficult to identify these visually. They can be from different species of algae. So it can make the water look kind of cloudy or brown just below the surface, and that tends to be a type of algae called golden algae. Or if you're seeing more of a greenish color with larger flecks in the water that might look kind of white or bluey green color, then that may be your blue-green algae. And these types of blooms can also often occur below a really steep temperature gradient in deeper water, so you might not actually see it if it's further down in the water. The golden algae in particular can produce some of these taste and odor compounds in drinking water, which can actually be minimized if you are using lake water for drinking purposes and are treating it and still finding that there's some noxious taste there. That can be minimized with activated carbon and also aeration systems. Blue-green algae can also produce these taste and odor compounds, and as I mentioned, sometimes produce toxins. So if you are seeing sort of a really green color with a lot of these little flecks, then it may be worth following up with the Spills Action Center. In terms of the mat-forming algae, most of these mats are what we call filamentous green algae. So it's green algae that are forming colonies and will sort of look like these big long filaments that can sort of clump together and turn into mats on the surface of the water. So the color can vary from sort of a bright green to yellowish green, even brown on the edges as it starts to die back in the fall. And then further as it ages, can look like a sort of a reddish color. So these mats are not harmful. They can harbor bacteria, so if you're handling it, maybe worth washing your hands afterwards. But yeah, definitely no toxicity issues. Very, very rarely you can see a blue-green algae mat that would actually be growing on the bottom of the lake bed. So in maybe really stagnant waters that are very nutrient rich. So the example here is a stormwater pond. Or it might be sort of a wetland area that's really stagnant, has lots of nutrients. And so these mats can form on the lake bottom and then can float up to the surface in little chunks. So they kind of look like frog skin. They've got these little bubbles in them and sort of quite a deep and almost bluish green color to them. So again, you would just want to avoid contact with those little clumps. Moving along, so looking at attached algae, again, these tend to be filamentous green algae species that instead of forming mats on the surface, they'll actually attach, colonies will attach onto things like rocks. And so it can make things very slippery, but again, it's not harmful per se. Sometimes you'll also see them forming sort of these clouds. Some people call it elephant's knot. Clouds around aquatic plants. So again, not harmful. There may be higher densities of bacteria within those clumps. Just as things kind of get caught up in them, it's almost its own little microcosm in there. So yeah, not harmful, but maybe avoid kind of playing with it too much. And also we can see different types of biofilms forming on rocks as well that's more brownish in color. And so this tends to be diatoms that form these films of biofilm on these surfaces. And lastly, we have macroalgae, which, as I mentioned, is actually colonies of algae that look like plants. So they're not harmful, but some of them can produce some of these taste and odor compounds. So for example, the macroalgae Chara, which is common in Lake Couchiching and other waters that are very clear and have a lot of calcium, like hard waters. So they can produce sort of garlicky smell and taste. They can form quite dense growths and cover a large area of the lake bed. And they tend to be very common in marina areas where aquatic herbicide have been applied to control other aquatic plants. But because these are algae and don't function the same as aquatic plants, they're not killed by the aquatic herbicide, and so they tend to take over because of that. So oftentimes, other natural phenomena or things growing out in the lakes will look like algae blooms, and in fact, they're not. So a very common mistaken identity is pine pollen. So in the spring, if you're seeing sort of a slick that has more of a light yellow color to it, it's a good indication that it's more likely pine pollen. Whereas the same slick can look very similar on the surface, but when you look at it a bit closer, it definitely has that kind of bluey green color to it and tends to occur later in the season. So the color and the timing are really good clues. We are seeing blue-green algae blooms occur earlier in the season than we have in the past. So if you're really unsure, it's best to take some photos and follow up either with SSEA, the health unit, and also the Spills Action Center, because it is hard to tell sometimes. But definitely the color is a good indication. And if you're seeing sort of that pollen dust on other surfaces, your car, for example, then again, that would be a good clue that it's more likely the pine. Another very common mistaken identity is duckweed, which from a distance can also look very similar to a dense blue-green algae bloom. But again, when you start to look at it a bit closer, you can see that there are individual little plants there. And if you pick it up with a stick or whatever and flip it over, they do have these little root structures. So that one's a pretty easy one to distinguish. Looking at filamentous algae versus aquatic plants, again, from a distance, they can look kind of similar. Upon closer inspection, you can see that the filamentous green algae mat will look like a very thick mat kind of right on the surface of the water and sort of have that woolly, fibery look to it if you kind of poke it around. Whereas looking at aquatic plants more closely, you can obviously see those plant structures, and you'll often see the roots going down towards the lake bed. Can often be mixed with green algae as well, just as things are kind of accumulating in slow-moving areas. So if you do come across what you suspect is a blue-green algae bloom, you can report that to the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, Spills Action Center. So the phone number given there, and they will arrange for sample collection and testing of the bloom for toxins, and will also identify the particular species that are involved. They'll then send these results to the Simcoe Muskoka District Health Unit, who will then issue a warning, if necessary, to the municipality and to the public. So if you ever see a sign that is warning of blue-green algae bloom in the area, that sign is posted through the health unit. So if a bloom is suspected, and maybe before it's been actually confirmed, Be cautious and assume that there are toxins present until you find out otherwise. So you want to make sure you avoid exposure to the algae. So this means not drinking the water even if it's been boiled or using it for cooking. So boiling can actually make toxin concentrations higher as the cells break apart when you boil them and will actually release more toxin if it's in fact present. Avoid eating fish caught from the area as well. Contact with the lake water, obviously, so through swimming, water sports, showering or bathing. And make sure you don't allow pets or livestock to drink the water or swim in the water either. So we want to really reduce the growth of these nuisance algae forms and potential harmful algae forms. So phosphorus is really the key nutrient that controls the growth of algae. So we want to limit nutrient inputs, which will help to control those blooms. So some different techniques that you can use to do this are listed here. So if you're not on municipal servicing, you have to make sure that you maintain your septic system. So this means pumping it out every 3 to 5 years, depending on how often the system is used and how many people are up there. Inspecting the septic system along with those pump outs. And then also reducing septic output. So using water conserving techniques, low flow fixtures and that sort of thing. You want to make sure you eliminate fertilizer use, especially within that 100-meter zone of the shoreline. Maintaining a natural shoreline is really important as well. So minimizing or reducing completely the amount of lawn that you have and maintaining a nice wide buffer of native shoreline plants. Shrubs are really great at stabilizing the shoreline and reducing erosion there. So reducing runoff and soil erosion is also very important. So maintain vegetation in particularly vulnerable areas. So things such as next to cleared pathways and on steep hills and that sort of thing. And really just trying to minimize those hardened paved surfaces on your property. Want to encourage native rooted aquatic plant growth in the water itself along the shoreline, which will help with taking up phosphorus and just sort of settling sediment that might be in the area. And then finally, just not restricting water circulation around docks. So the more water movement there is, the less likely that you'll have those really still conditions that the blue-green algae thrive under. So it's in terms of predicting future blooms, it's definitely difficult with any certainty to be able to predict a bloom. But there are some different factors that can sort of increase the likelihood of bloom formation in the future. So a history of excessive nutrients or past algae blooms can definitely be sort of a predictor of future blooms. So lakes or bays that have nutrient-rich and iron-rich sediments can really feed into those blue-green blooms. And if the water body is deep enough and has low oxygen down at the bottom, this can sort of increase that risk of future bloom. Natural features that some water bodies make them just more prone to blooms than others. So very shallow lakes that get quite warm or stagnant areas, again, that are still and warm. Earlier ice off, which can basically just result in a longer growing season for both plants and algae, can be a contributing factor, as well as spring flooding, which just brings a lot of additional nutrients into the lake. And then warm summer and also early fall temperatures is quite key. Reduced cloud cover as well. You think more sunlight is going to lead to more plant and algae growth. So temperature really is quite a key factor in bloom formation. So we expect as water temperatures increase that the total amount of algae is likely to increase as well. So SSEA has been monitoring water temperatures across Severn Sound since the mid-80s, and there's definitely been a significant increase in water temperature. And the rate of increase in the early fall is actually double what we're seeing for the summertime period. So blue-green blooms are likely to become more common under these warmer conditions. So reducing the nutrient load is sort of our best bet in trying to get ahead of this as much as we can. So just very briefly on how SSEA monitors algae. So we do water quality sampling across Severn Sound and also the inland lakes in the area, as well as tributaries. So as far as our open water monitoring and lake monitoring, we're looking for algae communities, so trying to determine what species are present through sampling. Sampling in different locations and also at different locations in the water column itself to determine where the densities are highest. And then sampling throughout the season to determine when, when these different groups kind of appear and disappear throughout the season. And then looking at how these patterns are actually changing through time. Another thing we look at is which species tend to dominate over others and why that might be. And then what are the implications of those changing patterns. So I've left some resources here if you want to do some further reading about blue-green algae from some different sources here. Also, the Federation of Ontario Cottage Association has an excellent guide on maintaining healthy waterfronts, as well as some really great tips on septic system maintenance. If you're looking to get involved in doing some lake monitoring, we do have some different programs that you might be interested in. So Shore Watch is sort of our lake-focused program, which can be done from either shore or dock or boat, and basically just includes different measurements and environmental observations that help us keep track of what's going on in different areas. Stream Watch, similar program, but focused on streams in the watershed. And then finally, we have our ice spotters, where citizens basically are recording when the ice comes on and when it goes off your local lake. So if you are interested, get in touch with us, and we'd love to sign you up. And appreciate very much your time and interest in this topic. If you're interested in learning more, you can follow us. We're on Instagram and Twitter, and also we have a YouTube channel. And this presentation will be posted there as well. So yeah, please get in touch.